Thanks for checking out this video, where I'll be painting Xargatha from Guards of Atlantis 2. I have a couple quick asides to mention. First off, thank you so much for the support and positive comments. I told myself that making videos would be worth it if just one or two people find them helpful, and the reception has honestly been amazing and really motivating to me. Second, the Guards of Atlantis Kickstarter recently launched, and I'm not affiliated at all, but I definitely recommend you check it out. I've played a lot of board games, and this is definitely one of my all-time favorites, and there's a reason I chose this game to be my first big painting series. But now I'll switch back to actually talking about painting. With all the scales, Xargatha was a really fun model to paint, and you can get a striking result with fairly little work. I'll paint her to a level that you can stop at if you want a quick but decent tabletop quality model, and then I'll continue to refine and work on various parts of the model to push them a bit further. If you feel inclined to spend time and energy on cleaning up mold lines, which helps but is totally optional, there's one on the top of the spear blade and the attached arm, and a few other spots around there. And there are mold lines on the extra arm there, but they won't be very noticeable, and there's one running along the top of the spear haft. There's also one along the right side of the body to get to. I just scrape these away with the side of my hobby knife, but you can also use fine grit sanding sticks if you prefer. Then you can prime the model in any medium-ish gray color, preferably a lighter one since the color scheme in general doesn't have too many dark colors. You could also prime a light green or a tan color or something like that, but I'm using gray since it's a pretty common color for priming and doesn't require going out and buying a special colored primer or rattle can. Now I'm doing some dry brushing to build up some jumps in value before applying color, and I'm trying out something a little unusual with the colors here. First, doing a very heavy dry brush using a pale yellow color. I use a large cheap makeup brush, grab the yellow paint, and wipe it almost all off on a paper towel, and then I dry brush the whole model pretty heavily. Normally I just use a light gray here, but I think these yellowish highlights might help a lot to provide some nice vibrant highlight color to the snake scales, as well as a good base to work from for the skin. Then I do a lighter, more constrained dry brush of pure white, just to boost the lightness of the highlights a little bit more. Moving on to blocking in the colors, I start with the most visually important part of the mini, the snake scales, and the snake head fin stuff. For this, I'm using two colors of speed paint. The first is a darker green made by mixing equal parts Grim Black and Absolution Green, and the second is a light green made by mixing a tiny bit of Absolution Green into Malignant Green and thinning it down a lot with speed paint medium. Then I roughly blend these together onto the model. The light green goes on the upper parts of the snake scales, and the dark green goes into all of the shadows and recesses. You can work them back and forth a little bit, but the speed paints tend to blend together fairly well if you just apply them next to each other when they're still wet. Just be careful not to pull the dark paint too far towards the bright areas, as it'll have a tendency to sort of take over. Now the exact paints that you use here don't matter, but I suggest using speed paints or contrast paints because it makes it a lot more vibrant and easier to apply. If you're using acrylic paints, be careful because they dry pretty quickly, so you have to be fast with putting them on the snake scales. I also suggest making your dark color pretty dark and your light color fairly light, but it's okay if in general this tends towards the darker side, since it will be easier to dry brush highlights on that make it brighter in the next steps. If you're not confident in doing this wet blending of paints onto the mini, I'd opt to just block it entirely in with the darker color, and then just dry brush it later to add some highlights to the scales. Next, I thin down this Vallejo Malefic Flesh color with a lot of water to turn it into a wash, and apply it all over the skin. I know this paint is one that lots of people probably don't have or can't get easily because it comes in a set, so if you don't have it, just grab any medium flesh color and mix in a little bit of purple to make a sort of desaturated gray purple color. You can apply one or two extra passes of this color if you want to build up the shadows a little bit more, thickening it if you want, just being pretty controlled with the application if so. Then I mix together equal parts Fire Giant Orange and Holy White and apply that to all of the sashes and cloth. The art shows these as an orangish red on the hero dashboard, but tan on all of the actual card arts, but I opt for the more interesting color and pick the orange. I use orange and not red here because I want to try to keep the model from looking too Christmassy in theme. Not that the red would look bad, but it's easy to get the holiday color scheme result if you aren't careful to avoid it. After that, use any black color you prefer to paint all of the armor panels, the gems, and the weapon. I'm testing out the Vallejo Express colors, so I'm using Express Black Lotus, but you can use Grim Black Speed Paint, Black Templar Contrast Paint, or just thin down any old black acrylic paint or ink with a bit of water. The art shows some parts on the panel, the armor, and the spearhead that are a bright, almost glowing green color in the art, and we can do those details in later steps, but for the basic painting level I'm not too worried about it, and I just paint those over with black in this step as well. Also be careful when you're painting the shaft of the spear. It gets a bit tangled around the skin areas by the arms, so just go slow and wipe off any black paint with a damp brush if you accidentally get it somewhere it doesn't belong on the skin. As a quick aside, this Express paint is totally fine but isn't completely blowing me away or anything. I still really like the runny gel consistency of speed paints, so those will probably still be my go-to contrast type paint. Now the only thing is to thin down whatever color you want to use on your base. I use Vallejo Model Color Khaki, and apply it liberally to the small bits of the base that you can see. And I think this is a pretty good stopping point if you want a basic tabletop quality paint job. Everything has color on it, and the star of the show, the snake scales, really stand out and look great. Some parts, like the black armor, look a little bit basic, but we can work on that in upcoming steps if you want to keep working on the mini. But if you're trying to go fast, or just don't want to dive into the more advanced steps, this is a pretty decent place to stop. Forging on, I think the human skin is the part that can be improved the most, and will really help to boost the look of the model if we refine it. I thinned down a mix of P3 Thrall Flesh and Vallejo Model Color Ivory, possibly mixing in a little bit of that Malefic Flesh color from before, and highlight up the skin in a few thin layers, working in more of the ivory color as I do smaller and smaller highlights. I focus mainly on the ribs and the spot under the belly button, the sides, the upper chest, and the face. I also highlight up the hands and arms, but those are less of a focal point on this mini, so I think they don't need quite as much attention. Next I paint the silver details that I ignored before, using Vallejo Model Color Airbrush Silver. I then use Black Lotus Express Color again to darken down the black armor more, and you can optionally use this to shade down the silver a little bit as well. Next I take Pro Acryl Burnt Sienna, or any brown color that you'd like, and thin it down substantially and use it to shade the orange claws. I do this a second time, also mixing in this dark mahogany color to get an even deeper shadow. You'll notice that when I apply this, I also try to avoid the brightest orange highlights with this color. Now it's time to turn our attention to the light green, almost glowing areas that we ignored before. I thin down a bit of pure white and apply it pretty heavily into the areas that will be light green, which will make it a lot easier to get to that light green color instead of having to build it up from the black. I apply 2 coats of this white color, but it doesn't take very long. Notice that when I'm doing this, I'm also painting a glowing effect in the eyes just because you see it in the art and I think it's pretty fun. Then I thin down a bit of P3 Worm Green, or whatever light green you want to use, and apply it to all of the white areas. Then I mix a darker green color into this. I use Vallejo Model Color Yellow Olive, and mix in a good amount of water, applying it as a wash and trying to keep it out of the very brightest areas. Then I take the light green color from before, and mix in a little bit of an ivory for a final highlight to these green sections. Optionally, you can follow along with what I did and push the glow effect on the eyes even further. I glaze the worm green heavily around the eyes, and then I dot the very centers of them with pure white. This is just to make the eye glow effect look a little bit more pronounced, and if you mess up this white dot, just fill in the eye with your light green color and try the dot again. Continuing on with more highlights, I highlight up the black armor in several steps using Vallejo Model Color Dark Sea Blue, and mixing in a little bit of white in a few layers. Nothing fancy, and I'm not trying to go too overboard with this. I'm pushing the color itself fairly light, but I'm only applying it mostly to the edges and the areas that I think should get the most highlights, and trying to be pretty restrained with it. Black is a notoriously tricky color to paint in a way that looks interesting but still has some depth in color and value. If you get your highlights too thick, just take a thinned black paint or speed paint and use that to knock the color back a little bit. Then I do the same thing to the orange sashes, highlighting it up in a few layers by mixing any orange paint you like with any off-white or yellow color. The same as before, as I mix in more of this yellow or ivory, I focus my highlights more and more around just the very raised edges and surfaces that I want to stand out the most. I'm okay with going a bit intense on the highlights here, because I want this cloth to stand out a bit, and to make sure that the prominent green colors I've used for the scales aren't too dominating and overwhelming on the model. To highlight the silver on the weapon, I do a quick edge highlight of Vallejo Air Color Chrome, just trying to give the silver a quick bit of extra interest. I basically just drag the side of my brush along the edges of the spearhead, and then put a little line on the bottom of the oval shape here. Now I decide to push the scales a little bit further too, using my ivory color and highlighting the edges of some of them. I don't highlight every scale, not even every scale in the more raised areas of the snake body. I just choose scales somewhat randomly, sometimes doing individual ones, sometimes gently dragging the side of my brush along their edges, just kind of picking ones that feel right. Just be careful if you drag your brush along the model, not to flood any of the scales with white paint if you have too much on your brush. I also almost completely forgot about highlighting the Medusa snake headdress fin stuff, so I go back and make sure to do those highlights here as well. And as basically the final detail, I decide to go the extra mile and paint the small gems on the back of the sash, picking a deep red and working up to pure white. There isn't too much surface area on these, so just try to get the impression of a jump in color if you can. And I focus the highlight more towards the bottom of each gem, but you can also just highlight the tops instead and it'll look just as fine. This is definitely an optional step too. You could totally just leave these gems black or gray or silver and they'd look perfect. Now the only thing left is to finish up the base, shading it down with a darker brown color, and then dry brushing it heavily by mixing in a little bit of off-white or yellow color into the khaki color from before. Then I paint the base rim black and we're done. This was my second time painting Xargatha, and honestly it was still just as fun as the first time. I really enjoyed painting the snake body, and there aren't too many different areas of color to mess with on the Mini. Once you paint the snake scales and the skin, you already have a really nice foundation, and everything else after that just feels like working on details. I've got a few other Guards of Atlantis models already painted, I just have to edit together the videos, but let me know if there's a specific hero you want me to add to the queue to paint next. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.